Hello tankers and tankettes, welcome to one of my What Tank videos, an occasional series where I take an overview of various aspects of World of Tanks. And before we actually get into this video, I will mention, as you may have noticed, there is a 1080p option for this video. Yes, don't get all excited though. The reason I'm doing 1080 for this video is that when recording in Tank Inspector, the output files that I get once I'm finished editing in Vegas, they compress to a reasonably small size. So I'm having a little experiment. I'm seeing what the final output will be in 1080p. Don't expect all my videos to be 1080p because the regular replays, there's a lot more action, there's a lot more data involved in recording that action, and my poor internet pigeons just can't handle it. So if I do Tank Inspector videos in future, I will probably continue to record at 1080p for those, but you won't get 1080p for most of my videos until basically my internet improves, and that should be sometime in the next 12 months, so it's hopefully coming sooner rather than later. Anyway, on to what this particular video is about. I'm going to look at the Tier 8 premiums. I'm going to take an overview of the ones that are available in the game right now and also ones that occasionally come available through special event offers, and that basically means the KV5 in this case. I'm not going to be looking at all the Tier 8 premiums. I'm not going to be looking at the Type 59. I'm not going to be looking at the WZ-111. I'm not going to be looking at gift tanks or reward tanks. I'm also not going to be looking at ones that are available in the data files right now, which mostly means the Panther 88, because I'm recording this just before 9.5 comes out. That is due in a week or two at most, and that brings with it a new German premium medium tank. But you can't even play that one on the test server right now. The only way to know what that's going to be like is to buy it blindly when it comes out on the 9.5 live server from the gift shop. You won't even be able to buy it in-game, because what Wargaming have done for the last couple of patches is when new premiums come along, for at least the duration of that first patch, you can only buy it from the gift shop on the website. After that, after the next patch has come out after that, you can then buy it in-game, but the fact that you can't even play it on the test server for the patch it's being released with, that's a new thing, and I don't think that's a good move by Wargaming. I think that actually is a little bit anti-consumer, because you don't get any idea of what the vehicle's going to be like. Only the super testers really know what it's like at this point. Only those people who've gotten their hands of it. Not even the community contributors have gotten a chance to look at that, and they've gotten an early look at the reward vehicles that are coming. So yeah, I do not approve of that move by Wargaming, not one bit. It doesn't help out anybody except their bank balance, basically. So, all that said, yeah, Tier 8 premiums. The reason I've particularly gone straight to the Tier 8 premiums is because it's one of the most frequently asked questions, is what's the best Tier 8 premium? The fact is, that isn't actually the right question to be asking. The right question to be asking is what's the best Tier 8 premium for you? Because what suits one person isn't necessarily going to suit another person. Yes, some are stronger than others, some have certain strengths and weaknesses. Well, they all have certain strengths and weaknesses, but some have more asymmetry than others, I'll put it that way. Some are better all-rounders, others are more asymmetric. But even so, even the least popular ones are going to have their fans. So even though I might not especially think well of a particular vehicle, you might still get along just fine with it. So bear that in mind. I'll also say that jumping in straight to a Tier 8 premium when you're relatively new to the game, if you've only got, say, 1,000, 2,000 battles, yes, they are the best money makers by far. Not necessarily the best crew trainers, but certainly the best money makers. But you're going to be thrown into higher tier battles with basically not really enough experience, unless you're a particularly good player. For some people this won't matter, but for the majority you're going to be really struggling. You're going to make the credits, but you're not going to make as many credits as if you were playing effectively and actually helping your team win on a consistent basis. So as ever, my recommendation is not to immediately jump in and buy a Tier 8, because you're going to be relatively out of your depth, and if you're expecting this to be the sort of game where you go and buy something and it's better than a regular tank for its tier, you're going to be wrong. World of Tanks and well, Wargaming really, the way they pitch the premium tanks, generally speaking, I mean there are some exceptions. Generally speaking, they are worse for their tier than a fully upgraded equivalent tank. So a tier 8 premium tank, a heavy tank, is never going to be, in theory, quite as good as a fully upgraded regular heavy tank. That's how they pitch it. It's not always quite right, but that is what they aim for, and that is largely what the premium tanks are in fact like. So we're going to start off with actually the original question that I posed. What's the best tier 8 premium tank? It's obviously this thing. It's the tier 7 Japanese auto-loading medium, the Chi-Ri, because it's the best at everything. yeah, I know that's Sercon's joke. It's not my joke, but I thought I'd throw it in there anyway. So we'll actually start with the Chinese, and I'll note now that not every line has got tier 8 premiums. The British don't, the Chinese don't, no, they're not the Chinese, the Japanese don't at the moment, although it's planned that there will be, but there are some lines that are lacking at the moment. The Brits don't either, although they have some lower tiers. And I'm trying to think, the French have only got one, the Russians have probably got the most. Actually, no, they don't, they've only got two. The Americans will have the most. But the Chinese have actually got, considering the size of the tech tree, they have 4 listed anyway. The Type 59 I'm not covering because you can't buy it anymore, and the WZ-111 you've never been able to buy outside of the Chinese server, so again, not looking at that. I'm mostly going to be looking at the tanks that you can actually buy right now. I'm not covering the upcoming, the German one, the Panther 88, because like I said, no one's actually played that yet. Yes, I can look at the stats in Tank Inspector, and I might have a quick look at it, but the stats that are in the 9.4 client data aren't necessarily going to be the stats that it has exactly when it comes out with 9.5. So it will be a quick look, but take it with a pinch of salt. So we're going to start off with the 112, and this is a machine I own. I actually have owned or do own most of the tier 8 premiums. The T34-3, which is the other Chinese one, is the exception. And I don't have a Super Pershing any longer, but I did once upon a time. So yeah, bear that in mind, that some of these are test server impressions rather than live server impressions, but I will try and convey some flavour of what the tank is about, because this is not a detailed review of any of these machines. This is an overview, it's an impression, and it's designed to help you maybe make your mind up. But if you are particularly interested in a specific vehicle, go and look up reviews for that specific vehicle, and that will give you much more information. As ever, I always recommend looking up 2 or 3 reviews at least, because not everybody's going to cover the same information, not everybody's going to come from the same point of view. I myself, I have a preference for heavy tanks, so you're going to have to bear that in mind when I'm talking about the premium mediums that are available. They're not necessarily my cup of tea, but I will try and be fair and honest in terms of how I see their capabilities. So, the 112, it is the Chinese tier 8 premium heavy tank that you can buy right now. Like I said, there's another one, but you can't actually buy that, so we're not going to really bother even looking. It is not that distant in terms of playstyle, in terms of its capabilities, than the IS-6. One of the reasons why is that it basically shares a clone of the gun. It's a 122mm gun, and it's called the D25TA. So yeah, D25. That's if you played any of the Russian heavies, the D25 122mm guns are ones that you should be very familiar with. The major difference between this and the IS-6, though, is in the premium ammo. The handling stats are not particularly great. I mean, we'll take a quick look. It's a sea of red arrows, and it was like I was saying, this is compared to the average tier 8 heavy tank. Yeah, it's below average in pretty much all regards when it comes to the gun, and the penetration's a bit lackluster. But the premium ammo is better than the IS-6 premium ammo, because the IS-6 has APCR with, I can't even remember what it is, 200 and, it's not that far over 200. Well, we'll see when we get to the IS-6. But this has got heat ammo with 250 average pen. and it actually carries more ammo as well. It carries 45 rounds versus, is it 30? 34 rounds, something like that. So the gun handling is as bad as the IS-6, but you get better premium ammo and you get more ammo, so you have to worry less about wasting shells. So that's an advantage the 112 has. In terms of mobility, I think, if I'm remembering correctly, the IS-6, it's, well, actually do a direct comparison, because that's a nice thing that you can do with Dank Inspector. Where is the IS-6 hiding? Now, the speed is better, and the reverse speed is better. Terrain resistance stats are better, but it has a worse power to rate ratio. So it's one of those things where the IS-6 is better, going up slopes, going up hills, but on flat ground or going down slopes, the 112 has the advantage. So in terms of its mobility, it's hard to say which is better per se. They have their advantages in specific ways. The other thing that makes this similar to the IS-6 is the armor, and this is basically the hull of the 113, and you can see visually they look very similar. They both have a 120mm upper front plate. That's got, however, a 100mm lower front plate, whereas the 112 has got an 80mm lower front plate, so they're not identical. And the lower front plate is a major frontal weak spot of this thing. Even when angled, there are plenty of lower tier vehicles that can and will hurt you, because it's fairly soft. And why did I look at that? I always get confused with this. There are plenty of things that can hurt you, and it's problematic because the fuel tanks are located in part behind the lower front plate. So it is entirely possible to get shot frontally and be set on fire from the fuel tanks. That is something you have to watch out for. It also has fuel tanks along the sides as well. But the side armor, it has one nice feature that the IS-6 doesn't have, in that although the nominal value is, again, 80mm, part of that side armor is a strip of 30mm spaced on top of the 80mm, so very useful for stopping heat shells and for blocking HE splash damage. Obviously, beneath the tracks it is 80mm as well, but as you can see, there aren't any track holes modelled with this particular armor layout, so the 80mm strips are fairly thin. They're not particularly tough, but if you're angling sufficiently, you can bounce a goodly amount from those. Of course, it being only 80mm, you have to be careful not to over-angle, but hopefully you'll know not to do that anyway. Of course, the IS-6 has got kind of beveled corners, which this doesn't have, so it is almost more effective at angling as well, because this 120mm upper front, it's 120mm. It's pretty effective when angled, so if you can get people to shoot your upper front plate, that's pretty nice. Now, because it's got that flat turret, with, I should note, rather prominent commander's hatches, I mean, they're fairly tough. 150mm each, but still, they're quite prominent, and 150 isn't going to stand up to the 200 plus pen guns that you can see at tier 8 and 9, because this thing will see tier 9s. The turret is fairly tough, but because it's a low profile turret, like the rest of the Chinese and like quite a lot of the Russians, it doesn't have particularly good gun depression. In fact, we can see right here that the gun depression is -6, so it's not awful, but it's not particularly great, and that's actually tied with the IS-6 in terms of how much you can depress the gun. But the elevation's worse. Sometimes that matters. It's not going to matter that often, but on the whole, I mean, I think general opinion is that it's sort of a bit inferior to the IS-6, and although it has its own strengths and weaknesses, I would tend to agree with that, but it doesn't make it a bad tank. Like I said, in terms of mobility it's mixed, in terms of armor it's mixed, but it's got enough of everything that it will work in pretty much the same way that the IS-6 works. It's just you need to tweak your playstyle to cope with the exact foibles of this machine. The lower front plate especially, you really do need to learn how to hide that effectively, because getting set on fire frontally with the fuel tanks behind that thing, it's not particularly fun. Next up we have the T-34-3, and like I said, I don't have this in my garage. My only impressions are from playing it on test servers a couple of times. But I think I've heard enough other people talking about it that do actually own it. I've seen reviews and such to give some opinion on it. Take all this with a pinch of salt, of course. Now, probably the defining feature of this is that it has exactly the same gun as we've just seen on the 112, the D25TA. 175 average pen, 250 pen with heat. The gun handling stats are pretty terrible. I think worse than the 112. But in theory, the lower pen matters a bit less because it. Where are we? It's more of a flanking machine, but it has some things that really go against it. I mean, the on-the-move handling stats are okay. Some of them are worse. The standout figure is the fact that it has -3 gun depression. That is pretty terrible. But it's got better mobility than the 112, although it's not superb. And the hull it's all right. I mean, it's actually quite familiar if you've seen the Type 59 on the battlefield. The T-34-3 doesn't look that different. The hull looks a bit higher, but I think it's more or less the same chassis. But the turret is where the best armor is. So if you can go hull down in this thing, that's fine. But with -3 gun depression, you're not going to be able to use the hull down capabilities except on basically flat maps. So while the turret armor is very nice, there are going to be limited opportunities to use that. It's going to be more about flanking round behind people and getting that big beefy gun to bear. But just the combination of stats and the kind of playstyle that's required for this, I think I'm going to be fairly right in saying that this is not a tank to go to if you are new to high-tier medium tanks. If you haven't played any high-tier medium tanks at all and you buy this, you're probably going to have a fairly horrible time because you're just not going to even begin to have the first idea of what to do with it. It is a tank that is quite unforgiving in terms of inexperience. You need to know what you're doing to get the best out of this. So I think if you are a more comfortable player with the higher tier mediums, if you are a good player, you're confident in your stats, you're confident in your play style, you can probably do quite well with this. But it has the set of limitations that it has means that it's going to be a very unforgiving tank to players that aren't comfortable. And I know I would definitely fall in that category. It's one of the reasons why I've never bought one, is that I know I would probably just get frustrated with it more often than not, just primarily because of that gun depression, but because of those gun handling stats as well. So, yeah, that was a bit more brief than the previous one, but feel free to contradict me if you have different points of view about this vehicle. But I think I'm not wrong in saying what I say. You know, if you want a Chinese premium vehicle, then the 112 is probably your port of call. This is definitely the one you go for if you are desperate for a medium crew trainer, or you want something with a bit more mobility, and you know what you're doing in medium tanks, because you really do have to. Next up is the FCM50T, and this is actually the premium matchmaking tank that gets the best penetration of any of them by far. 212 average pen with AP and 260 with APCR. And for a limited matchmaking tank, the rest of them are 170, 175. The KV5 gets, 167. So this blows them out of the water. It has less alpha damage, of course, but of all the tanks that can mount the DCA-45, which is up to and including the 5100, this has the best handling for that gun of all of them. I think I'm right in saying, but I might be wrong about that. I haven't actually gone and checked. This plays more like a big medium tank. If you're expecting armor, this doesn't particularly have it. However, the armor on the front, it's not terrible. It's 120 again, but if you compare the slope of this to the 112, I mean, this is a much steeper angle. So yeah, you might bounce some things off this, but don't count on it. Don't ever count on the armor with this tank. The most bounces you will ever get will probably be from the turret on various angles, because as you can see there, the gun mantle immediately around the gun is, well, that's only 120 as well, basically, but a little bit further back it gets over 200 effective. So you might occasionally get bounces off the turret, but you can't rely on it. What you do have to rely on is the good gun handling stats, especially when you're on the move. It's a very mobile tank. It gets up to 51 kilometers an hour, reverse speed 20. You know, this is all well above average. 1,000 horsepower engine. Horsepower per ton is very respectable indeed. Chassis traverse speed 40, again for a heavy tank, that's damn respectable. So it's the mobility that defines this and the gun handling. You're going to be taking a lot of snapshots with this. In the IS-6, in the 112, you have to sit, you have to let your guns settle, unless you're really close range against somebody, but even then, those guns might troll you hard. This one, it's very good at peaking over, using that 8 degrees of gun depression that it gets, which again is pretty damn good. It's very good at peeking over terrain, getting off a snapshot, and then pulling back. You don't especially want to be sitting and aiming and aiming. You can use it as a sniper. I mean, it's a reasonably accurate gun. It will make you a reasonable number of credits, and I think if you're comfortable with I was talking about with the T-34-3, if you're comfortable with medium tanks, that might be one to go for. This is probably a better one to go for if you're comfortable with medium tanks. Now, it's the only Tier 8 French premium tank at the moment, and it's got 5 crew slots, which at the higher tier French, I mean, they only have 4, so you're going to have a spare radio man usually. But for the lower tier French, that's quite useful, because a lot of them have crews of 5. But it does make good credits, and just in its own right, I think it's an alright tank to play. Especially the extra penetration compared to the rest of the limited matchmaking tanks. So I would say, although people maybe overlook this, don't necessarily discount it. If you want a faster vehicle and you are more in tune with the medium playstyle than the heavy playstyle, although this is a heavy tank, although you may not necessarily be playing French heavy tanks, this is still not a bad choice. You can rack up reasonable amounts of damage with this, and even 2k damage is enough to walk away with like 50-60k profit. I can't think off the top of my head what it is exactly, but all the premium tanks got profit buffs in the not too distant past, so it especially helps out tanks like this, where although the alpha's not especially high, the gun handling and penetration are enough that you can stay at longer distances and use those abilities to take peekaboo shots or to treat it like a medium tank to flank people, to get around behind people. It is very good at all that kind of thing. You're not going to be right at the front with the fastest mediums, but it's got enough speed and enough horsepower per ton that it opens up areas of the map to you that wouldn't necessarily be available with other tanks. So yeah, don't discount this. I think this is a pretty good tank for all of its foibles as a heavy. You know, if you think of it like a heavy, you're not especially going to get the best out of it. But if you think of it as a heavy medium hybrid, you will do a lot better. So yeah, this is one of those ones where it bears thinking about it in a different way than you might necessarily look at it and think. So that goes for the French heavies generally, actually, come to think of it, but that's a different video, maybe French heavies at some point. Anyway, yeah, so we'll move on to the next one, and it's going to be quite different, I can tell you that. So we come to Germany, and this is at the moment the only Tier 8 premium tank destroyer that you can buy. The German line also has 3 in total, so if you want to train up your tank destroyer crews, the Germans are particularly good for that. They're also going to get, as a reward tank, this Stug 4 when the personal missions come in later. So you'll have 4 different vehicles you can train your crews on. And this gets 6 crew slots as well, so it is a very good crew trainer in that regard. It used to be one of the best money makers as well, although I never regarded it as one of the most fun tanks to play. In fact, this is probably one of my least favourite premiums of the ones that I still own. Now, what it is a Jagdtiger with the long 88 gun, and it is nerfed in mobility compared to the Tier 9 Jagdtiger, but it does have the same armour layout effectively. So you've got 150mm upper front plate, which at Tier 8 is alright, but you don't really want to rely on it. The superstructure is 250, so that's the best armor it gets. If you can sit hull down behind a rock or a pile of rubble and just have your superstructure showing, that is as good as it gets in the Tiger 88. And you've also got, well, you've got a weak spot there with the MG port. The side armor is pretty terrible, 80 degrees, 80 millimeters, but at an angle, you are going to bounce stuff off that. So flat on, it's not going to pose any challenge, but when you're angled, it's not too bad. And yeah, it's all about the rate of fire with this. It's almost British in that regard. You get this long 88 and you get a very, very good rate of fire with it. You can see there, we'll actually see what it's like with the gun rammer on. The DPM of this thing, 3089. It is pretty damn good. Like I said, it's like a British tank destroyer almost. The penetration's not that good, but again, limited matchmaking, and it's a matter of getting to the right places on the right maps and crossing your fingers, because like some of the Brits, and I'm thinking especially the Churchill gun carrier here, the reasonably poor mobility means that you have to choose fairly early on where you're going to go, and then for some maps, for some situations, you're just going to have to sit there, or you're going to have to be rolling forwards behind your friendlies advancing, because you don't especially want to be at the front in this thing. It doesn't traverse particularly well. It does get flanked fairly easily. It's not as bad as, say, the AT-15A, but of course, unlike the AT-15A, it doesn't have quite as good a gun arc, not by some margin. So what you want, ideally, with this thing, is for your enemies to be driving at you in a straight line, for somebody to be spotting them for you, and for you to just sit there without having to move and just pour the fire out at them. And that is the absolute best case scenario. That is what this thing excels at. When it comes to more close quarters combat, it's like the Churchill gun carrier, it suffers badly. You need enemies to always be at your front. And the moment that you let people get closer, then it starts to be a whole lot less fun. So I still occasionally take this thing out, but if I need credits, this is not the one that I play anymore, because basically the other tier 8 premiums were buffed to match the level of credits that this made. It used to be that if I needed credits desperately, I would play this thing, and I would find it frustrating, and my win rate is probably worse in this than any other tier 8 premium, but it would make the credits. And that's still true, it still will make the credits, but for the equivalent damage, the other tier 8 premiums are pretty much as good these days, so I don't have a special reason to play this anymore. So if you're desperate for a tier 8 crew trainer for your German tank destroyers, this is it. But there are better tier 8 premiums. This is not the one I'd necessarily recommend, but having said that, there are people out there that really like this machine. I think they're probably in a minority, but it might be that this really suits your playstyle for tank destroyers. So bear in mind that I don't particularly like that kind of playstyle of tank destroyer, but you might be perfectly fine with that, in which case you're going to be fine with this. And if you can do the damage, it still prints credits like nobody's business. So yeah, it's more of a mixed bag. I would say this is one of the weaker tier 8 premiums. I think I personally would place this among the my least favourite, but least favourite doesn't necessarily mean least good. Yeah, it's one of these things where your opinion may vary. So there we go, that's the Tiger 88. And so we come to the first of the regular matchmaking premiums that we're going to look at, the Löwe. This is a fairly iconic sight on the battlefield. It is one of the premiums that's been in game for a reasonably long time at this point. And it has a bit of a reputation because it's one of those ones that people go for when they really don't know any better, just assuming that it's going to be better than other tanks for its tier. It's really not. It did get some buffs not all that long ago. That was in the last couple of patches. It had some armor buffs basically, but it's still not the best machine in my opinion. Now, armament-wise, the reason why it's not a premium is that it has this 10.5 gun, which is unique to this vehicle. It's the 10.5cm KWK L70, 234 penetration, which is good for a tier A heavy, and 320 average damage. So it is a pretty damn nice gun for a tier 8 heavy tank. It's just the rest of the tank that kind of lets you down. we'll look at the armour, and the armour in theory isn't that bad. It's 120 on both the front of the turret and the front of the tank. The side armour was actually buffed from 80 to 100, so it can much more effectively side scrape than it used to. It used to be not particularly good at side scraping, but these days actually, if you can side scrape and hide that frontal plate, then by all means you should, because the somewhat bouncy turret, I mean, it's not fantastic, but if somebody catches the edges of the turret, it's going to go off. It's just if somebody shoots around the gun mantlet, it might be more likely to pen, especially if you manage to get underneath that turret ring area. But the around the gun mantlet is a tricky proposition, because the gun mantlet itself is pretty big and also pretty bouncy. So it's a mixed bag with the turret. You know, there are weaker areas, but hitting the weaker areas, especially at longer ranges, is not going to necessarily be that easy a proposition. It does suffer in terms of mobility, and one of the things that irks me about the Löwe, and has always irked me, is that for this armour layout, this is a 90-ton tank. This tank is, yeah, it is way heavier than you'd think it would be given the armour that it has. To put that in context, the where are we? The VKB, and we look at the weight for that. The VKB is actually lighter than this, and it has ridiculous amounts of armour at the front, and it has I think a heavier turret. There's like nearly 20-ton turret. It's like 18.5-ton turret, and the where are we? Go back to the Löwe. The turret on this is actually lighter. So oh, that was the wrong thing. It doesn't really make sense. I never could figure out where all the weight is supposed to be on this tank. I mean, if you look at all the module weights, it doesn't especially make sense that it is as heavy as it is. Personally, I mean, my theory is that it was designed by the Germans to transport concrete blocks and elephants. At that point, the 90-ton weight might make sense, but otherwise, it really doesn't. It is a very heavy tank, and the side armor buff was very welcome. But honestly, I think the thing it's always needed more is either a slightly better engine, so it gets better horsepower per ton ratio, or I don't know, maybe a better top speed, so that even just going downhill you can maybe get a bit more mobility out of it. But it's not a particularly flexible tank in terms of getting around the battlefield, and that's always kind of irked me. It's just the fact that it is so heavy for no apparent reason. It's just wargaming, I don't know. The actual explanation for that, and I know this through reading various FDR articles, is that it is essentially a mashup between I think two different specifications for the Löwe, and Wargaming have kind of mixed and matched the actual the paper specifications to get the vehicle that we see in game. So we have the armor of a lighter vehicle, because 120 is all right, but there are much lighter vehicles that have 120 frontal armor, with the weight of a much more heavily armored vehicle. So that's always bugged me about the Löwe, and for that reason alone, I would not say it's the best one to get. But it can perform well. It has got a good gun. It has got a very accurate gun. So if you can stand the slower pace, and I'm not in theory opposed to slow tanks. I like some very slow tanks indeed. It's just normally if it's a slow tank, it has some compensation for being a slow tank in that it has a decent amount of armor. And frontally, that's just not quite true for this thing, considering it can see tier 10s. So on that count alone, I always consider that a stroke against the Löwe, and will continue to consider it a stroke against the Löwe, up until the point where either they lower that weight and basically give it a bit more mobility, or they increase the frontal armor to actually make it make sense for having 90 tons. So yeah, it's not terrible. It wouldn't be the one I'd say to go for a regular matchmaking premium, but if you are playing a lot of German heavy tanks, well, you don't have a lot of other choice, to be honest. So It's not terrible in that regard. It's certainly not the worst of the tier 8 premiums, which I would consider to be the Actiger 8.8, but I know some people will disagree with me. But it's definitely not the best. It's got its problems. Next up, the first of the Americans we're looking at, the Super Pershing. And if I had to pick a defining characteristic for the Super Pershing, it would be that it's the cheapest tier 8 premium. Yeah, that's pretty much it. It used to be better than it is now. Basically, I can't even remember what patch it was, but what happened was all this spaced armor at the front got a nerf, and it became quite a bit less effective than it was previously. So, although once upon a time it would have been easy to say the defining characteristic of this was its armor, and that I could have called it a kind of heavy, a medium-heavy hybrid as opposed to the FCM being a heavy-medium hybrid, it really can't even claim that anymore. The frontal armor's not bad, but compared to what it had, it isn't as much a challenge, and the upper front plate especially is, especially this upper area of this spaced armor, towards the middle area, if you know where you're shooting, it's a lot easier to hurt these things than it used to be. And it's not like they lacked for weak spots before, because you always could hit the commander's hatch. You just had to aim for the tubes. In fact, even the area sort of below the commander's hatch, this kind of dip in the armor here, it's still not particularly strong. So it's not like it was that well armored to begin with, and it basically had more or less a straight nerf. It did get some buffs to its mobility to compensate for that, but the gun remained untouched, and it's this gun that's one of the things that makes it not particularly great. Now, the point of the real life Super Pershing was that it had a better gun than the regular production Pershing did at that point, and the armor was actually an in the field adaptation. The armor that is on the turret especially, that wasn't really intended to be extra armor. That was actually a counterweight to the gun, as was this spring system. In fact, the spring system proved inadequate enough that that's why they added this extra plate there. So the turret is still, that extra armor there is still fairly tough, but you can just shoot, above it. That was always the case with this tank, and it's still the case now. But they made the front plate, the upper front plate, that much weaker. And although the lower front plate's still fairly reasonable if you're angling, you can't angle too much because 76mm of side armor it's not especially great. So once upon a time you could tank the damage in this and use it as a kind of pseudo heavy tank, but you can't really do that with anything like the same degree of effectiveness these days. So yeah, it's the cheapest, and it's the cheapest for a reason. And although frankly looking at the barrel of this gun, it looks like it should have a pretty good amount of penetration, it kind of doesn't. It's one of those premiums where looking at the stats, it's 170 AP penetration on average, and with APCR 258. So it's more or less explicitly designed to sell premium ammo. So basically, if you are playing this, you can afford to less sit and aim and go for weak spots as you might have been able to once upon a time, and it is basically there as, I almost want to be really cynical and say it's there as a really cheap tier 8 premium that you then don't make much credits with because you're spending most of them on your premium ammo. This is less penetration than the IS-6 and the 112 get, and it has less alpha as well, so it's inferior in all regards, and it doesn't have medium mobility to make up for it because it's got all that extra weight on the front of it. What it does have is a lot of hit points, but it doesn't really make up for the rest of it. As you can see, there's a lot of red. It is quite below average, especially when it comes to mobility, compared to all of the other tier 8 mediums, and really compared to all the tier 8 heavy tanks as well. One way in which they really could buff this, and that the 170 pen wouldn't make that much difference, is if they made it tier 8 only, if they restricted the matchmaking even further. But honestly, I don't see them doing anything like that anytime soon. So yeah, I would not recommend this especially. You can still make it work, but it doesn't have the mobility to get around the fact that it also doesn't have penetration. So unlike the IS-6 and the 112, where you can be fairly aggressive brawlers with those, you can't really do that with this machine because it doesn't have the armor. It doesn't have the mobility as the T-34-3 kind of does. It actually has a worse gun than the T-34-3 in many regards. It's hard to recommend this except for the fact that it is the cheapest, and like I said, it's the cheapest for a reason. So yeah, the Super Pershing, it's not what it once was, and even what it once was wasn't the best tier 8 premium by any means. Of course, it's still going to have its fans, as every tank basically does, but if this is your first port of call for a tier 8 premium, I think you're going to be slightly disillusioned with it. Then we have the other American Tier 8 Premium, and it's also the other machine that gets regular matchmaking. And I kind of have a soft spot for the T-34. It has its drawbacks. Again, the gun penetration is good, but the handling is not great. The aim time especially. But it has some other characteristics that mean that isn't such an issue. Now, it really is all about the gun, and that's why it gets the regular matchmaking. It's a 120mm gun with 248 average pen. That is better than the 128mm guns that the Germans use at the top tiers. So this is a very good gun for a tier 8. And for a tier 8 premium, it's really good because it also does 400 average damage. You do not need to fear tier 10s when you have this gun. It can reliably pen quite a lot of the tier 10s if you know where to aim. And in addition to that, it has basically got the turret of the T29 and also the T30. Now, it's probably a bit easier to pen the turret weak spots of this than it is with the T32, which of course is the regular line heavy tank on the Americans, but quite honestly, it's still a good enough hull down tank, and it has enough gun depression, as we can see in this case, 10 degrees of gun depression, that even though the rest of the gun stats are below average and the DPM isn't especially great, it can reliably punch through the armour of even quite well armoured foes, and it can use terrain to its advantage. Of course, when you're on flatter maps, city maps, the weak hull armour becomes an issue, but that's true of most of the American tanks. The hull armour gets better at tier 9 and 10, of course, but American tanks, if you're playing them for their hull armour, you're not particularly going to have a great time. They're not awful, but they're not great, and the tier 7 and 8 hull, I mean, it's very similar to the T29 hull, this as well, and in fact also the T32 hull, I believe. We can have a quick look at that. Oh no, not the T32 hull, it's just the T29 I'm thinking of. T32 is kind of more Pershing-esque, I suppose, but it's got enough of everything, and it's got that big beefy gun that actually, even though in terms of its damage output, like DPM wise, it's not particularly great, and the gun handling is definitely what you would call poor, it can, if you're patient enough and smart enough, you can do quite a lot of damage with this gun. And I've had games where I've done quite a lot of damage with this gun and walked away with 100,000 plus credits. It's one of those machines where you can quite easily do that amount if you're lucky enough and playing well enough. So although it has got its drawbacks, I would say this is one of the stronger tier 8 premiums, and with that big beefy gun, you really don't need to be afraid of anybody, but you still have to play smart because your hull is a significant weak spot. And even if you're hull down, there are places on the turret that if you're angled, if someone can shoot down on that turret roof, or even someone can shoot the commander's hatch, you can see that it's not especially strongly armoured. So, you have to be aware of its weaknesses, but if you are, you can actually do really effectively with this machine. And these days, this is my go-to machine if I want to make some credits in a tier 8 premium. It doesn't hurt that I've got a very good crew for this thing as well, but as a crew trainer, as a credit maker, I feel this is one of the better ones. And it has 6 crew slots, so you're never gonna have to worry about excluding anybody, or like with some of the Russians, you end up maybe having to rotate people around, and it can be a bit annoying. But with this, that's just not an issue. So yeah, if I was going to recommend one of the non-premium ones, I would recommend non-premium matchmaking ones. I would recommend this over the Löwe, but my personal preferences obviously come into that to some extent. And so onto the IS-6, which is probably the most brawly in-your-face of the Tier 8 premium tanks. Although the 112 is not that far behind it, I did mention the IS-6 a bunch of times in comparison. The gun is, as with the 112, 175 average pen. I think this actually has a slower rate of fire than the 112, but as you can see, the DPM on this isn't too bad. You can also boost that with a gun rammer, and that will get you 2300. That's fairly respectable. But you have to be fairly close range, and this is a good tank for that, because although the armor on this is good, it's fairly troll in some regards, it has issues. The turret's probably the best of it, as you can see, 150 all round, and with the shape of the turret. At the very front, you can be penned. Don't rely too much on the turret, and even the gun mantlet is not the strongest if somebody knows where to shoot. But anything that's hitting more than right next to the gun mantlet is just going to bounce off. It's a very bouncy turret in most regards. But the top of it, the commander's hatches, I mean, they're 150 as well, but it is just 150. There's no sloping to help that especially. So if you hit those square on, that is going to pen quite easily for most things this tank will face. But somebody in an IS-6 has to be sitting still and letting you have that shot for you to be able to reliably, effectively get that kind of shot. So the best way to play an IS-6, really, is if the situation feels like it's warranted, if you've got the backup to do it, or even if you're just one-on-one, is to be aggressive, basically. It is really quite a brawly tank, and being aggressive, throwing people's shots off, just being just harrying them and making sure they don't have the time to sit and take advantage of your weak spots. It has enough armor to do that and more. I mean, the 100 all-round armor for the upper front and sides it's very good. I mean, as side-scraping goes, side-scraping tanks goes, this is a pretty reasonable one. But it has one big flaw, and it's these beveled corners here, these shoulder areas. Now, the thing with these is, when you are sitting and facing somebody dead on, they are at their most effective. Any shot that hits you there is just going to bounce off. And the lower front plate, even when head on, is actually more effective because of the sloping than the upper front plate, although there is this slightly weaker area in the middle, 90 versus 100, and it's a very clearly delineated driver's hatch. So that is also an issue with the armor. If somebody shoots you through that, there is a decent chance they're going to kill your driver, so expect to have to heal your driver fairly often in this thing. But the thing is, the more you angle to give your upper front plate more effective armor, the less effective the shoulder that you're exposing becomes. And that's especially relevant when you're actually side-scraping against somebody, because if somebody knows what they're doing, they're not going to shoot you on the side, they're going to shoot you there. And as you can see, that is much weaker. So this is better as an aggressive pushing tank than it is a static defending tank. But if you come across somebody that doesn't know about that armoured shoulder weaker area, or the fact that it becomes weaker when you're angling like that, then you can still side-scrape very effectively. And I've had games where I have side-scraped very effectively. But on the whole, this thing is much better as an in-your-face tank. And if you prefer an aggressive armoured heavy, then this is probably the premium that you want to go for. Although maybe the 112 would suit you better, but at the end of the day, it's a pretty good tank, and if you can learn to overcome the sometimes frustrating nature of this gun and the terrible handling stats that it has, it really can be quite an effective machine, and it's certainly a good credit maker if you can get the damage up, as I suppose really all the premiums are these days. But of course, to make the credits, you have to do the damage, and doing the damage when you have 390 average alpha, it certainly helps. So the last of the machines I'm taking a proper look at is the KV5, and you might be thinking, well, the KV5 isn't available in the in-game shop, and it's usually not available in the gift shop. But just for the last, 2 years, it's been regularly available at least twice a year in the gift shop. It's probably going to be available this Christmas, and it's available to purchase often enough that I thought, actually, you know what, I will include it. And I've done a full review on this thing as well, which you can go and check out. It's one of my older reviews, but I think it's mostly still valid. The KV5, it's a bit of a funny beast. It is in some ways better armoured than the KV4 in terms of the hull. As you can see there, 150 side armour, 180 upper and lower front plate, and the turret front, the turret bulge, and it's even got, in theory, in some spot it's got 250, but that's the only spot really there is at the back. So the effective armor seems good, except then you get to what the KV5 is actually famous for, which is this Radio Man binnacle. And the funny thing about that is, if we have a look, the armor on the back of that is 140. The armor on the front is 120. So, although it is 180 on for the majority of the front of the tank that you're presenting to people, this is a massive enough weak spot that your effective armor is actually only about 120. So, although it is possible sometimes to hide that, it often isn't. And the main way of compensating for that is either not being on the front lines, or picking lone enemies, or choosing situations where you can side scrape and try and not expose that at all. But otherwise, you're just going to have to make use of your hit points pool, which is, by the way, 780. It is as good as some stock tier 9 heavy tanks. In fact, better than some stock tier 9 heavy tanks. So you basically have to make use of those hit points. It has all of those hit points for a reason. It was a while ago now, but it used to have fewer hit points, and one of the buffs they gave it was more hit points, because they were unwilling to buff the gun. And the gun is the other main letdown of the KV5. It is the gun, effectively, that the T150 gets, and the KV2 can mount it as well. The 107mm ZIS 6 with 167 average pen. Yeah, on a tier 8 heavy tank, and this thing can see tier 9s. Now, it does have slightly better premium than the IS-6 does. It's got 219 average pen. So again, if you see somebody shooting a lot of APCR with this, don't judge them too harshly, because the regular penetration is frankly rubbish. But it kind of compensates for that by having definitely better than average DPM. You can see there 2400 versus 1800 average. Actually, I don't know if that is showing up, but it's showing me in Tank Inspector anyway that it's got about 600 better than average DPM. And it also has better than average module. The reload, I mean, you can obviously make the reload better with things like ventilation as well, but it's a less than 8-second reload. So if you get the targets that you can actually hurt, you can really pump out the damage with that 300 average damage shell. It's kind of like the Chi-Ri in that regard. I know I jokingly showed the Chi-Ri at the beginning, but the Chi-Ri is one of those tanks where if you get a target you can hurt, you can really hurt them, and you can hurt them quite rapidly. That's the case with the KV5 as well. But the KV5 does have one other feature, quite apart from the well-known, the weakness of the gun, and the fact that your Radio Man dies practically every battle. It's the fact that it is, why did I look at that? It is basically as heavy as, in fact we'll bring up the KV4's stats in comparison. It's as heavy as the KV4. It's a 100-ton tank with a 1200 horsepower engine, and it has 10 kilometers an hour better top speed, more if you're going downhill, because you've got a few kilometers an hour extra. So if you're going to go downhill and you're going to ram into somebody, you can do quite a lot of damage, especially with the rejig of the ramming mechanics that Wargaming's recently implemented, because this is 180 mil over the entire front. There is no weaker lower front plate. You're always going to be hitting somebody with at least 180 mil of frontal armor. Now, Wargaming might rejig the whole ramming mechanics again to simplify it and have a kind of a front, sides and rear value when it comes to ramming, because at the moment it goes off the existing individual armor zones. But basically this means if you can ram somebody's front with your front, you're probably going to come off much better than they are, because you've got a lot of weight and a lot of frontal armor, and especially if you can get somebody's rear or side with this. And you might have seen on Jingle's videos, he has a special little, he uses the what is it, the Tyrannosaurus Rex sound from Jurassic Park, yes, that film. But yeah, basically, if you can come down a hill at somebody, it's got enough speed and it's got enough weight behind it that it can be truly devastating. And I think the only tank that can really be an equal in that regard is maybe the E50 and the E50M, possibly the E50M more so than the E50. But you know, the KV4, although it's got the weight, doesn't have the speed. The mouse is exactly the same. The VKB is exactly the same. You know, most of these very heavy tanks have a much more limited top speed than this thing does. So the mobility is not awful, but it has got such an asymmetric set of stats. You know, it's got not a very good gun, and it's riddled with armor weak spots, and even the strongest areas of armor. You know, the turret front, even if somebody doesn't hit that, 180, which is, you know, flat armor, and the side bits, which are 150. Even side scraping, you've got this monster 150 side armor, but if somebody with a big enough gun is just shooting at your turret, they can still just punch through the front of your turret. You know, it is sloped, but it's not sloped that much. So yeah, even the best armor is not necessarily its best armor. But even with the weak spots, you know, it always pays to angle this thing. It always it pays to try and wiggle it off. Wiggle it off. What? To wiggle it a bit and throw your enemy's shots off is what I was trying to say there, and my sentence got all smushed together. I don't know. I've been talking for a while now, so my brain is starting to I don't know, collapse under the pressure or something. But yeah, it is the ability to ram things. It's the DPM that really sets this apart, and it is a bit more difficult to play this as a serious tank. But if you're not taking it too seriously, and you do have a game where you manage to rack up a decent amount of damage, it's always been a tank where you could make a good number of credits. And these days, you can afford to be a bit more free with the APCR, because you're still going to make, even if you shoot a relatively large number of APCR shells, you can still make a decent number of credits. And frankly, who could blame you for doing it? Because 167 average pen on a tier 8 heavy tank, I mean, it's bad. It's just bad. It really is the other the novelty value of the ramming and just the package as a whole, that as long as you don't take it too seriously as a tank, that means that sometimes you can have very good, very funny results with these things, and other times you're just going to have absolutely terrible games. So it's a very asymmetric tank in that way, but I think it's fun enough to play. It has enough compensations for the downsides that I do still play mine on a reasonably regular basis. It's just, it's not my go-to tank to make credits by any means. It's not the one I go and play to seriously have a good time with. But it's not a terrible tank. It's definitely, I've probably said this already. In fact, I know I have said this already. It's not the worst of the tier 8 premiums. And if I had to pick a worst one, yeah, it would definitely be the Agtega. But yeah, this is not going to be to everyone's taste. It's an old beast in many ways. So before we wrap this video up, I will take a quick look at the ones that are available to view in Tank Inspector but aren't necessarily available to buy right now. First of these is the Panther 88, and it is basically a Panther hull with a different turret and that long 88mm gun. So it is sort of roughly equivalent to the Panther 2 in some ways. The hull's going to be worse, but I think the gun and gun handling stats are going to be slightly better. I'll actually just bring up the armor scheme so you can have a quick look. 18mm frontal hull, 50mm on the lower front plate and sides, 120mm on the turret front. So the turret armor is going to be the best, and the rest is, well, it's a Panther hull. It's not much to speak of. And we'll have a quick look at the stats as well. And because I'm doing this 1080p, you should be able to reasonably clearly see what you're getting. What's probably the most notable is that it will have .31 accuracy. That will probably translate as. Um, the numbers in Tank Inspector and the numbers that will be given in the client, I'm thinking that's probably going to look like .31 in the client, but Tank Inspector basically lists it for the exact values for the 100% crew basically. It's also going to have 1500 hit points, which for a premium vehicle, for a medium tank, that's pretty good. And otherwise, well, you can see for yourself and see in what areas it's above average and below average. It looks like it's mostly going to be a fairly reasonable machine. It's going to be a regular matchmaking machine just because it has pretty decent stats. So although in terms of gun it's going to be way behind the other two regular matchmaking premium vehicles, it is of course a medium tank, and it's going to be more relying on its mobility than it is sitting in front of other tanks and penning them frontally. So bear that in mind when you think, oh well, it's only got 203mm of pen. Well, so does the Panther 2. And the Panther 2 has, it's on the upper range in terms of penetration for Tier 8 medium tanks. And very lastly, we are going to have a quick look at the Scorpion, which, this is Tier 8. And let's look at the armour. This is going to have the distinction, this vehicle, of having some of the worst armour in the game at Tier 8. This is basically a beach buggy with a 90mm gun on it. Yeah, so it's not even like it's got a particularly massive gun. I don't know yet if this is going to be regular matchmaking or premium. It's probably going to be similar-ish to the E25. Very good camo value, and it's going to rely on that camo value and not getting spotted to actually survive. Probably will have a decent rate of fire as well. I'll show you obviously the stats in a second, and you'll be able to see for yourself, but those might change by the time this actually comes out as a vehicle that you can buy. But the hull is 1, and the gun shield has 5. So the very best that this has actually is the tracks. Yeah, the tracks are the best armor that this has. So, the worst armor in the game. I think the next worst is probably, 5 mil? I mean, you get some of the tier 1s are pretty bad, 5 to 10 mil. The E25's not great, the ELC's not great. There are some very poorly armoured machines in this game, but this is going to be the worst by far. So it's going to be all about not being spotted. HE shells are going to be absolutely lethal to this thing. Absolutely. So, quick look at the stats. It's a 90mm gun, and it'll have 219 average pen. So, that's not bad. That's slightly better than the equivalent French 90mm guns. 240 average alpha, which is absolutely standard. DPM doesn't look especially great, so it's not going to be like the E25 in that regard. Rate of fire, though, it's not awful, less than 8 seconds without any gun rammers or anything. Ammo count is alright. And other things, I mean, I imagine the view range will be okay, considering. But, I mean, Wargaming are talking about having a view range nerf, and it doesn't have especially a high amount of hit points either, considering all the other stats that it has. So, yeah, I mean, 45 to kph. It's not terrible speed-wise. Actually, that's much slower than the E25. So I don't think it's even going to be really analogous to the E25. It's going to have to be a machine where you really rely on being sneaky and just absolutely do not ever want to be spotted, because if you get spotted, probably you're going to die very quickly. You don't have the hit points, you don't have the armor, you don't particularly have anything. So yeah, this might change, but you can see for yourself, this is a much more mixed bag in terms of stats than the Panther 88 is. So actually, I can't imagine, with these stats anyway, that it would be a regular matchmaking. This must be a premium matchmaking vehicle when it comes out, unless they significantly buff some of these stats in some way. But I mean, it might have a place on the battlefield. For a tank destroyer, 10 degrees of gun depression is alright. 60 degrees of gun traverse is actually pretty damn good indeed. You are, what I was saying about camo value, you are going to be able to sit still and have a really wide gun arc where you can actually point that gun. Although the actual traverse of the turret itself doesn't seem especially good, but that is going to be useful in terms of not being spotted. But this is going to be one where you absolutely need a good camo crew, and it only takes 4, by the way, so you're not even going to be able to put all your crew on it from other tank destroyers that you have in the American line, but it will at least have the distinction of being the second ever tier 8 premium tank destroyer. So this might or might not come up in patch 9.5. I'm not actually sure if they're ready to release this yet. It might just be the Panther 88, but it's there right now in the data files, and if you've got Tank Inspector, you can go and look at it yourself. So, to wrap this video up, I think I've done my best to try and give you some idea of the flavour of each vehicle, what their strengths and weaknesses are. There's a good selection at Tier 8. If you like faster tanks, you're reasonably well catered for. If you want heavy tanks or medium tanks, there are a decent selection, although if you want tank destroyers, there really isn't at the moment. But even in terms of heavies, there's a good selection of playstyles. You've got some brawlers, you've got some good hull-down tanks, you've got some tanks that excel more at being snipers. So it really comes down to what tanks do you like playing right now, what tanks do you feel comfortable in, and what tank lines are you most interested in having crew trainers for, because obviously that matters as well. And some tank lines, there are the Russians, for example, it is possible to have 3, even 4 premiums if you manage to pick up a KV-220, and one crew getting 4 daily doubles out of premiums plus the daily double from their regular tank. You know, you can really rack up the XP with that kind of arrangement. I certainly did with my KV4 crew. That's how they got so good. But yeah, I mean, it's not all about tier 8. I will look at some of the lower tiers at some point, but tier 8 is where you will make the best credits, and there are some pretty interesting machines. There are some maybe less interesting machines as well, but I think there's probably enough selection there that you will find what you're looking for. I will, just before I end the video finally, say that, however, and I sounded this cautionary note at the beginning, I would not necessarily go and just buy a tier 8 premium. They are mostly not very cheap. The Super Pershing is by far the cheapest of them, but for the most part, these are big investments. You're talking kind of 30, 40 euros, 50 euros for some of the packages that they do from the gift shop for things like the KV5, sometimes even more. So I would always say, don't start off with the tier 8 premium, although of course it makes the best credits. You don't know if you're going to stick with the game that long, and that is the price of a full-priced game for one vehicle in World of Tanks, and there are many of these, and I don't even want to know how much I've spent on this game. Some of these vehicles have been gifts from other people. Other vehicles I have bought because I have had gift packages that involved gold, and I've had enough gold to then get them from the in-game shop, so I haven't necessarily bought them all myself, but I've probably still spent the equivalent of a good couple of €100, maybe 200 or 300 euros on this game. Microtransactions are anything but in World of Tanks. If you want to start off with a premium vehicle, I would always say consider a tier 5 or a tier 6 before you shoot all the way up to tier 8. I would have at least a tier 6 or a tier 7 vehicle in your garage before you contemplate a tier 8 premium tank, because that's the start of the game getting more expensive and less rewarding in terms of credits, especially if you're just playing with a regular account rather than a premium account. So you could jump in with both feet and buy one of these rather expensive vehicles, but it would not be my recommendation by any means. But hopefully you're not at that stage, you're a slightly more seasoned player, and hopefully the information I've given you here, based on my own experience, based on the experience of others, will give you a bit more idea of what each vehicle is about and how each vehicle plays. Of course, not everyone's going to agree with me on every point, but such is the nature of the internet, and I might even be wrong about some stuff. That's always possible. This is all based on my opinion and the opinions of other people that I know. So, bearing everything I've said in mind, and I'm sure there will be many a debate in the comments section about what's the best one, you can leave any comments below, you can hit the like button, you can subscribe to my channel, you can check out my other What Tank videos, and as always, stay tuned for more.